It was actually quite appropriate that we had Director Gaston Schulmeister from the OAS Department Against Transnational Organized Crime, because that is where we're going to end our conversation today, talking about transnational criminal organizations and their internationalization, right? And so with that, let's start with our final panel of the day. And our moderator is our very own Dewey Turner, who is a senior fellow at the Gordon Institute and former head of Southcom's Women, Peace, and Security program. So please give a round of applause to Dewey and our panel.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Leland, for the introduction. This is the last panel of the day, but we want to end the program as strong as we started. So for that, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, esteemed colleagues and distinguished guests. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our panel, the Internationalization of Transnational Criminal Organizations, TCOs. Our discussion will look into the strategic alliance, the strategic aspects of these criminal organizations and the implications with their growing influence in our hemisphere and beyond. Anything is on the table for our panel, including the alliances with organizations in China, Albania, and beyond. One of my favorite topics is strategic competition, also human security, governance, economic alliances. We'll look at it from a macro scale all the way to the city level. And for this, we have an exquisite cadre of experts to share their knowledge with us. We will start with introductions, then we'll have comments, and then follow with questions from the audience. So I hope that you're prepared to share your questions with our panelists. It is my privilege to introduce you to our distinguished panelists. Dr. Wanda Felba-Brown is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and the director of the Initiative on Non-State Armed Actors. She is also the director of the Africa Security Initiative and the Brookings series on the global reach of opioids. Welcome. Yes, why not? Let's not hold until the end. Excellent, thank you. Dr. Will Freeman is a fellow for Latin American Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. He holds a PhD in politics from Princeton University and was a Fulbright Scholar in Peru, Colombia, and Guatemala. Welcome. Thank you. Dr. Ivlog Griffith is a fellow with the Caribbean Policy Consortium and Global Americans and a senior associate with the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He is a prolific writer. Last night was the launch of his latest book, Challenge Sovereignty, the Impact of Drugs, Crime, Terrorism, and Cyber Threats in the Caribbean. If you missed yesterday, the magnificent event that we had, you still can grab a copy. Congratulations on your book. Professor Maria Paula Romo is an Ecuadorian politician, lawyer, and professor. She was elected twice for Congress and also served as a Minister of Government for Ecuador between 2018 and 2020. She is currently part of the Adam Smith Center for the Economic Freedom here at FIU. Bienvenida. Gracias. Last but not least, Secretary Cesar Restrepo is the Secretary of Security for the city of Bogota, Colombia. He has over 22 years of experience in national security and defense, holding leadership positions at the Ministry of Defense, think tanks, and Pro Bogota Region, where he developed a metropolitan vision for urban security. Bienvenido también. Well, we have a lot to cover, so let's get right to work. Wanda, you have done extensive work on understanding illicit economies and also organized crime. So my question to you starts at the larger scale, the macro scale. How have TCOs such as the Sinaloa Cartel and the Cartel de Jalisco Nueva Generación expanded throughout America, Latin America, and what are the consequences of that expansion regionally and also cross-regionally?
Well, thank you, Julie. We are talking about the internationalization of criminal groups. And we use the term TCO, transnational criminal groups, which gives away the punchline that they operate beyond one border. And this is, of course, not new to Latin America. It's been part and parcel of organized crime in Latin America since the 1970s. What is different today is the reorchestration of the criminal groups that are operating, big changes broadly from the Colombian groups that, of course, still exist, but are far weaker, even as they operate internationally, the rise of the Sinaloa Cartel and Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, and the spread of their bipolar war from Mexico across the entire Americas, but also the rise of new actors outside of the region. So let me start with the Latin America dimension and then reflect with you a little bit on the outside of the continent actors. The Sinaloa Cartel and Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación are the two large Mexican criminal groups that have been spreading in Mexico. They are increasing their control over territories, people, and institutions. And doing so over the past 5 years of the López Obrador administration with essentially no pushback, certainly no law enforcement pushback of any heft from the Mexican government. At the same time, the groups, although we refer to them often as drug cartels, have greatly expanded to many economies, illegal, but also legal beyond drugs. In fact, what we are seeing today in Mexico is the takeover of legal economies from any kind of resources, whether it's mining, logging, fisheries, agriculture, by these criminal groups and their ever-growing encroachment on the legal economies, not simply in terms of taxation, but in terms of direct ownership and direct control over many of these economies. Now, as they have expanded their scope of operations, they have not limited this into simply the functional scope in Mexico, but pushed beyond Mexico. They are some of the most powerful drug trafficking organizations in the world, matched only by Chinese criminal groups that I'll come to in a minute. And they are locked in a bipolar war between themselves, but that bipolar war gets very messy on the local level, as the competition between them is forcing local criminal groups, whether in Mexico or outside of Mexico, in places like Costa Rica, in places like Chile, in places like Ecuador, to choose one or the other. They're voracious capitalists. The form of their competition does not really give space to their local proxies, local vassal, to operate on both sides. And especially Jalisco was the actor that initiated this, you're with us or you're against us. You cannot play with Sinaloa as well, but this has now spread. And so this bipolar competition forcing local actors to choose has blown up the so-called islands of peace, as some of these countries in Latin America, the Chiles, the Costa Ricas, the Ecuadors have been referred to, and we have seen dramatically escalating levels of violence that law enforcement institutions in these countries had never encountered before and are not able to cope with. Now, Sinaloa, even before we had the explosion of the violence between the two, has been aggressively pushing into developing networks of corruption and being very effective in doing so outside of Mexico. Meanwhile, the local criminal groups are also learning from their Mexican overlords that they can push into new economies. They don't have to stay locked in simply to drugs. They can expand into mining. They can expand to wildlife trafficking. And that is generating further pressure. So that's one dynamic. The second dynamic that gets little focus, but has a potential to further up violence in Latin America, is the graduation of the Primeiro Comando de Capital, PCC, a Brazilian group, from the local favela boys to the big league of criminal groups. While they are not yet at the level of Sinaloa, they're not even at the level of Jalisco Nueva Generación, they have developed not just operations across Brazil, but outside of Brazil, with significant stakes and direct engagements in places like Argentina, in places like Venezuela, and even across the ocean in West Africa, since they are part of the cocaine corridor to Europe. The third dynamic is the arrival of European groups in Latin America, particularly in the Southern Cone, where they are challenged, but they don't face the same challenge from the Mexicans. So you don't really have the Albanian mafia or other groups like Turkish groups operating in Mexico. The Mexicans are simply too strong to allow that, but you have them developing in places that long seem to be the kind of more marginal markets. Peru, very strong growth of Balkanian criminal groups, the Albanian one of which is only one. At the same time as these groups in Europe have been challenging the Italian groups, the Nandretas, the Camoras, the groups that for many decades were at the top of the criminal pyramid, are feeling this very strong pressure from the Turkish group, from the Albanian groups. And part of the pressure is that these groups are developing, have developed, I should really say, direct operations, at least at the level of transshipment and hubs in the Southern Cone. And the final, two other dynamics I want to quickly come to. One is a very significant one, and that's, of course, the arrival of Chinese criminal groups into Latin America. This is not new. It's part and parcel of China's engagement on the tail of Chinese legal economies, legal trade comes illicit behavior, development of corruption networks, and often the growth of not simply illegal economies in natural resources that are then shipped to China, whether we're talking about timber, various kind of mineral resources, or wildlife trafficking, but more purposeful arrival of Chinese criminal groups that have a managed relationship with the Chinese government, that often serve various functions of the Chinese government, one of which is controlling Chinese diaspora, making sure that it doesn't cross the interests of the PCC and the Chinese government, but second of which is purposeful building of corruption networks in the business class, in the political class, that can then be utilized for a wide variety of purposes beyond criminality, beyond simply illegal economies. And the final dynamic that I want to mention in this internationalization and end with that is the expansion of particularly the Mexican groups and especially the Sinaloa cartel outside of the Americas. Sinaloa cartel has long been present in Asia, but in very small role. And they have now expanded the role to a far greater scope. They have had long collaborative, cooperative relationship with Chinese criminal groups. They are still in existence, but in other areas, Sinaloa is directly clashing with Chinese criminal groups in places like Australia, like New Zealand, in the active development of meth markets for Mexican meth. We have seen the expansion of both groups into Europe with significant deleterious consequences for Europe, including big expansion of meth markets and the potential for big expansion of fentanyl and synthetic opioids. And we even see the Mexicans developing substantial presence in places like the Middle East, none of which will necessarily stay all peaceful and easy. And so many of these places that have had powerful criminal groups, but very low violence levels, in striking contrast to the Americas, might now be finding a challenge of far greater levels of violence than they had been used to.
Thank you so much, Wanda. You raised some excellent points here about the far-reaching impact of those organizations. Particularly, I was really interested in your point about the blurred lines of corruption, corrupted governments, and the connection with TCO. So thank you for sharing that. Well, now we go big picture, and then let's come a little bit closer to South America. And my question to you is, how has the criminal backdrop changed in the last decade, considering some significant inflection points such as the 2016 Colombian Peace Accord? And what are some of the implications of that to illicit markets?
Well, first of all, thank you, Dewey. Thanks, everyone, for being here. It's a pleasure and honor to join you. And thanks to Leland and Brian for organizing this conference. I'm glad that you asked, Dewey, about the last decade. You could imagine asking that question about shifts we've seen in the criminal landscape over the last couple of years, over the last 30 years. But I actually think there's a reason to break off the last decade and analyze that as a period of time. And that's because I think something really significant has happened, something which I refer to as the reorganization of South American organized crime, where it operates, how it operates, and the consequences it has for democratic politics in the continent. So let me briefly in these remarks highlight 3 ways that I think that the criminal landscape over the last 10 years and change has changed, and then link that to what I see as the biggest challenge for the region's democracies today, which, to put a point on it, I think is curbing the power of organized crime without sacrificing rule of law and democracy along the way. So the first of the 3 changes that I see, and this one, I think is the most widely discussed. It's the fact that between 2014 and 2023, according to UN figures, cocaine production in South America doubled, maybe more than doubled. We know that this expansion was led largely by an increase in the area under cultivation in Colombia, something somewhat surprising given that throughout the 2000s and even into the early 2010s, the area under coca cultivation in Colombia had pretty steadily decreased. However, slightly before the 2016 peace accord you mentioned, you saw a turnaround in that story. And I think there's a number of factors at play there. The price of oil dropping took a hit to Colombian government revenues. It was harder to sustain costly strategies of coca eradication and programs paying coca farmers to take up other types of cultivation. There was a decrease in U.S. assistance. And last but not least, in the wake of the peace accord, the Colombian government struggled very much to fill the territorial vacuums that were opened up by the demobilization of much of the FARC structure. So you had a new battle for criminal control that created conditions where coca cultivation could continue to surge. So there was this important increase that I mentioned in Colombia, mirrored by important increases in Peru and to a lesser extent Bolivia. And by the end of the decade, by 2023, 2024, where we're sitting now, coca cultivation, cocaine production in the region has never been higher. So that's one side of this first important change to the cocaine market. The other is, and it coincides with it, is what I'd call the globalization of demand. So you go back to the late 2000s, 1 in every 2, or rather half of all cocaine consumed in the world, according to UN figures, was consumed in the United States. What did that mean? It meant that the most important transit routes flowed northwards. They started in Colombia and Peru. They traced up through Central America and right through Mexico. But what happens in the 2010s that's really significant is that by the end of the decade, you have 3/4 of all cocaine consumed in the world being consumed in Europe, Asia, Africa, and within Latin America itself. So the relative weight of the US market declines. And I think that all of this together, the surge in supply, as well as the globalization of demand for cocaine, leads to a reorientation of both the methods used to transport the drug and the routes used to transport it. So on the method side, we see more and more maritime cocaine trafficking. That makes controlling ports increasingly important, ports dotted all over the South American continent. And you also see a real change in then the routes to reach mostly those ports, as well as internal markets. So there's some that were long established, for instance, the Venezuelan route, then through the Caribbean to reach Europe. But you also see these new routes opening up, as Dr. Felba-Brown referred to, one through Ecuador, another one through the heart of the Amazon to reach Brazilian cities and also Brazilian Atlantic ports, and along the Paraná River, passing Paraguay and later the port of Montevideo. Why do I bring this up? Why do I put my first point of emphasis here on this change? I think it's because the doubling of the size of the cocaine economy really gives a cash infusion unlike any other before to the region's criminal groups, to the PCC, the First Capital Command in Brazil, which after 2016-17 really takes on, as Dr. Felber-Brown mentioned, an international character, and also to groups like the Gaitanistas in Colombia. That's the first major change, very disruptive just on its own for the region. A second is that you see diversification of the criminal activities in which organized crime is involved. I think this is related to that first transformation I just talked about. One, it's because these new cocaine trafficking routes stimulate the growth of local gangs in places like Ecuador, gangs which cannot all profit from moving cocaine. So some of them move into extortion, some of them move into illegal mining. You get these different criminal offshoots in different parts of the economy. And the other is that I think increasingly with all this cash on their hands from the cocaine trade, criminal groups start to launder money in new ways. They launder it through financing the opening of illegal gold mines, right, in Venezuela or in Ecuador, through financing illegal logging operations, et cetera. And a third and final big change that I think we've seen in South America over the last 10 years is growing political power of organized crime. Often this is at the local level, right? But it's local level political power that can be leveraged to achieve national aims and to influence the behavior of national government. So, if you think back to the 2000s, I think there's a clear, and even 1990s, there's a clear precedent for this. It's what was known as parapolítica in Colombia, the fusion of drug trafficking paramilitaries with local government across the country, and eventually, their ability to obtain significant representation in Colombia's national legislature. I don't think we've seen that process go that far anywhere else in South America, with maybe the exception of Ecuador now we might be seeing. But I do think that there are little instances of parapolítica-like situations popping up in more and more countries. So I mentioned Ecuador. Think of a province like Manabí, I think fits this description. Madre de Dios, a center of illegal mining in Peru. Even in Sao Paulo, the kind of penetration the PCC has achieved of local politics, I think is really startling and should have us concerned. It's one thing for criminal groups to finance or to intimidate candidates running. We know that happens in large parts of the region. It's another to put their own candidates in place. And I'm worried that that's what we'll start to see across larger and larger parts of South America. So I'll just conclude here. How should governments respond? How should we be thinking about the ways that they respond? Look, I think because several countries that I've mentioned in South America didn't have to worry about large-scale organized crime before. I'm thinking of the Uruguays, the Paraguays, maybe the Uruguays, the Ecuadors, et cetera. They lagged in terms of their response to this issue and even waking up to it as a major problem. In the absence of an immediate and effective response, I think you're seeing radical measures, measures that sacrifice rule of law and democracy, gaining more and more legitimacy. I just point to this one fact. Bukele has 80% approval in Chile. In Chile, one of the countries which has seen an important but relatively less significant increase in violent crime in recent years. And yet even there, Bukele and his authoritarian methods really have gained this popularity. To avoid that being the route that the region takes, I think that there needs to be a coherent response from the region's democracies, ideally yesterday, but certainly today and not tomorrow. The alternatives to that are increasing militarization, or what Brian Winter of America's Quarterly has called the quiet quitting in the war on drugs or the war on organized crime. That is essentially an attempt to treat organized crime with the logic of if we don't bother them, they won't bother us. But as we see in Mexico, right, that does not lead to pacification. What would a democratic response take? And this will be my final point. One, I think it'll take coordination among governments of South America, sharing intelligence. I realize that that's a high bar. You have the diplomatic conflicts in the region that are flaring up between the governments of Argentina and Colombia, between Ecuador and Mexico further afield. But I do think that this is the bare minimum that we need, is for governments to be fluidly sharing information, because as we all know, these criminal organizations don't respect national boundaries, right? And if governments stay contained within their own, they won't be able to compete with them. Second, I think that the region needs to think more systematically and embrace a fight against corruption among police, prosecutors, and prisons. I put emphasis on those three institutions. So often we're seeing governments rely on the military because it's the institution that they feel and their citizens feel can be most trusted, but that's no long-term substitute for police, prosecutors, and prisons, systems that need to work well to make any headway in this kind of fight. I think there are too few Diana Salazars in the region, the brave Attorney General of Ecuador, who's leading exactly this type of anti-corruption campaign within the state in that country. And finally, and this is not at all the least significant issue. I think that all South American countries will face an issue when it comes to financing. They need to be able to finance the anti-corruption campaign, the intelligence gathering and sharing that I mentioned in my first point. And I think this is especially tough when the dynamics of growing organized crime and insecurity drive wealthy elites to leave their countries, take their capital elsewhere, and then their governments end up with even less resources to sustain this kind of fight. That's the catch-22, the cycle that the region needs to break. So thanks for listening through to that my analysis of what's happened in the last 10 years, and invite questions from the audience when we get to that point. Thanks.
Thank you, Bill. As you're talking, I'm thinking, wow, this who knew that this would have an aspect of chain management. You have to have a chain management perspective to solve this complex problem. And to Vanda's point, also the adaptability, the almost chameleon-like traits of this TCO. So thank you. Very robust presentation. Thank you. Sir, you're next. In the context of the known knowns and the known unknowns about TCOs in the Caribbean, now we're moving to the Caribbean, all those shared problems. What is a significant policy consequence impacting international actors concerned with the Caribbean security?
Thank you, Dewey. Let me add my thanks as well to Brian and Leland and the team at FIU and the partner entities for the invitation to be here this afternoon. A few colleagues in the room may know that I spent 12 wonderful years as a dean and a professor at FIU, and it's always good to come back and see the growth. FIU now has 58,000 students. When I left 16 years ago, there were about 42,000 students. I want to offer two preliminary comments before I get to my main point. The first point is to invoke a name of a defense secretary of the United States who had the distinction of being a Secretary of Defense twice. He was the youngest Secretary of Defense when he was first appointed, and he was the oldest serving Secretary of Defense when he was appointed again. Dewey has $100 she's going to give to anyone who can put the hand up and tell me the name of that person. You get to save your $100. His name was Donald Rumsfeld. And Donald Rumsfeld said something during the Iraq War when he was fielding questions at a press briefing. He characterized reality sometimes as having a phenomenon of having known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns. Known knowns, things that you know. Known unknowns, things you know you don't know, but also unknown unknowns. I invoke Donald Rumsfeld because I think as we have any conversation about transnational organized crime, whether it's in the Caribbean, Latin America, Africa, there are elements of a bridge between known knowns and known unknowns. And the elements of the known unknowns have to do with sometimes limitations of the intelligence gathering. Whether it's electronic intelligence or human intelligence, there are things about organized crime that we just don't know. So let's keep that in mind as point number one. But I want to make a second point before going to my substantive commentary. And that is to say that in responding to this question, I want to recommend that we move the conversation from the operational, tactical level to the strategic, conceptual level. For you to make sense of some of the known knowns that are linked to known unknowns, you've got to raise the bar of the discourse. And when you were to do that for the Caribbean in particular, which is the focus of our unit of analysis, I would propose, I would bet you $100 of Will's money this time, that if you ask the question, what is perhaps the most significant policy implication of organized crime in the Caribbean, it is what in this book I call challenge sovereignty. Challenge sovereignty is, for me, the most significant policy implication of the known knowns of transnational organized crime intersecting with some known unknowns. Now, Dewey is wondering, what the devil is this challenge sovereignty? She hasn't read my book as yet, so I'm going to tell her. Challenge sovereignty is a condition where the state's vulnerability is exacerbated by internal and external developments that compromise the ability of the supreme authority of the state to promulgate and to execute domestic and foreign policy in its own deliberative judgment. The state is compromised in making and executing policy because of some of those known knowns and some of those known unknowns. What I argue in this book, and I make the proposition in the book as well, that the notion of challenge sovereignty is not limited to the Caribbean. Challenge sovereignty manifests itself in other parts of the world. But challenge sovereignty is a function of three conditions. I'll read you what those conditions are. They're very short. Condition one, the authorized official of a state can no longer effectively protect the territorial integrity of their state from intruders, whether such intruders are state or non-state actors, and irrespective of whether the intruders aim to have a sustained presence in the jurisdiction in question or transit it. Condition one. How about condition two? The authorized officials of a state face such capability constraints that they are compelled to rely on other states and international agencies to underwrite public security equipment, training, and other resources, and on a sustained basis, such that the absence of those resources jeopardizes the effective maintenance of public security or national defense. But there's one more to go. It is when you take those two conditions, in my view, and add the third, you have the manifestation of challenge sovereignty, an experience in the Caribbean, an experience that is there in other parts of the world. Here is condition three. The authorized officials of a state lack the requisite capabilities to exercise effective internal public order and external sovereign control, which necessitates reliance on external capability support that, in turn, risks further compromising the independence of their actions in promulgating and executing domestic and foreign policies. So they're caught between a rock and a hard place. They need the external support, but some of that external support compromises their own ability to do things that they want. You may need intelligence, but you don't have the human or technological intelligence. You got to rely upon a US or a Canadian or a British or a French. If you're part of the French Caribbean gendarmerie, you don't have your own, you got to rely on the French. So my argument is, you survey the landscape of the Caribbean and you ask, what is the most significant policy implication of the combined impact of the known known and the known unknown? You have this circumstance of challenge sovereignty. Now, the challenge sovereignty has implications for other than Caribbean countries. Because on the one hand, the transnational organized crime is a manifestation of the transnationality of the enterprise. The drugs, the human trafficking, the other illicit activities are cross nations. But not only are they cross-national engagements, the states themselves that are managing these realities in the Caribbean need to work with United States, European Union. Southern Command is one agent for the United States. And so it is not only Caribbean countries that have got to be worrying about challenge sovereignty. It's the United States, it's Canada, it's European Union, It's countries far away. In this book, I detail some of the contours of trafficking, weapons, drugs, and humans, but sometimes go from South America to Africa to Europe, and then they come back to North America. I'll give you one anecdote, which I tell in this book, of a manifestation of that reality. I was in Quito, Ecuador in 1996 for a conference on hemispheric security. A short conference, and leaving the final day, I had the first flight. I was at the time still at FIU. First flight out of Quito back to Miami. Once I check in, I thought I'm going to immigration. I was pulled over by the security. Sir, can you come with us to have an interesting experience in our office? I realized that I was being profiled. They did the pat down. I had 2 pieces of luggage. I ensured that they make the examination of each piece of luggage so I can see. I didn't want to have something found in my luggage. The officer who was conducting the pat down was happy when he saw an American passport. And he was even more ecstatic when he saw my letter of invitation for the conference. And so at the end of the experience, I asked him, well, why did you select me? He began to explain the reality that had been a significant increase in Nigerian traffickers moving cocaine from Ecuador to Africa, to Europe, to United States, to the Caribbean. So I fit, I'm a black guy. I'm a black guy, right? Yeah. I'm a black guy. I'm making the first flight out of Quito. I fit the profile of a trafficker. That is one practical manifestation of the circuitous trafficking. And so whether it is for drugs or humans or weapons or exotic animals, a lot of which are smuggled as well, the reality is other than Caribbean countries have to be concerned about the challenged sovereignty of the Caribbean. Punto final.
Thank you very much. Now, when you started explaining the challenge sovereignty, you said for us to look at this from a strategic level. I must say, I just retired from the military, and I can see this completely translated into operational actions, right? Like a perspective, operational perspective, the lack of physical security, reliance on extra national actors for some countries, the lack of international control. I think there is a lot here that we can distill and really bring it to very tangible and practical action. So thank you. I have love for this. Maria, welcome. Okay, now I would like to bring it into the national level. So I'm very glad that you're joining us. Sadly, a lot of us have been observing and following the rapid decay of security in Ecuador. So my question to you is, how are TCOs contributing to the current situation, perhaps aggravating, right, the situation in Ecuador? And as a seasoned politician and scholar, what would be some policy recommendations to solve this difficult crisis?
Thank you, Dewey. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for the invitation. How does a small and Pacific country as Ecuador, with one of the lowest homicide rates in the region, becomes one of the most violent country in the world in 3 years? Just in 3 years, we came from a homicide rate of 6 on every 100,000 people, 6 on every 100,000 to 46 in 3 years. So how does that happen? What did we do? Or what we didn't? Or how all these external and internal factors, most of them have already been mentioned by you this afternoon. And I would like to use the Ecuadorian example to propose a few ideas, but you have already You have already spoken, you have already told us most of the internal and external factors that took place and brought us as Ecuadorians, but as a region, to this reality. If I may, I'm switching to Spanish just to be more precise. Me gustaría explicar lo que pasó en Ecuador, como lo estaba diciendo. Tal vez resumiéndolo en 3 factores: economía, geografía y vecindario, y debilidad institucional. Primero, economía. El Ecuador es una economía oficialmente dolarizada en América Latina. Entonces, la moneda nacional en el Ecuador es el dólar. Esto convierte al país en un lugar especialmente atractivo para una serie de delitos, y no solamente relacionados con el lavado, evidentemente, pero relacionados, por ejemplo, con la falsificación de dólares. Porque poner a circular moneda falsa de los Estados Unidos seguramente se hace distinto en Ecuador que en Estados Unidos. Convierte esto al Ecuador en un lugar especialmente atractivo y también les da a las autoridades mucha mayor dificultad para controlar, por ejemplo, el cambio de divisas. Yo decía economía, un factor. El segundo, geografía y vecindario. Geografía, el Ecuador está en la mitad, sus 2 vecinos son los mayores productores de cocaína del mundo. Perú y Colombia son los mayores productores de cocaína del mundo. Ecuador está entre los 2, tiene la gasolina más barata, la economía dolarizada, las playas más extensas y además físicamente mejor localizadas para las rutas marítimas de transporte de cocaína, de personas, de oro, de todo lo que se ha diversificado, como lo decía Will. Tiene las playas más extensas, las más cómodas, y el puerto de Guayaquil envía una cantidad de contenedores hacia Europa, que además suma este atractivo, entre comillas, a las organizaciones criminales europeas. Pero como estoy hablando de geografía y vecindario, no hay cómo dejar de hablar de Colombia. Y cada proceso de paz, de desmovilización en Colombia ha tenido su propio impacto en el Ecuador. Y pasó con la desmovilización de las FARC, y pasó con el proceso de paz del ELN, y está pasando ahora con la política de paz total del presidente Petro. Esto en la práctica para el Ecuador representa que hay un gran interés de los vecinos, aquellos que no abandonan las actividades ilegales, de trasladar sus actividades al Ecuador, y además lo hacen con gran facilidad, mientras en muchos casos esto implica para el gobierno o el ejército, la policía, las instituciones colombianas, un cambio de política respecto del combate a estas organizaciones criminales, sobre todo durante los procesos de paz. Si todo esto fuera poco, el Ecuador pasó por varios años de malas decisiones institucionales. Y en el 2009 el Ecuador decidió no pedirle visas a ningún ciudadano de ningún lugar del mundo. Hay quienes atribuyen esta decisión a la mala fe, porque la verdad es una decisión tan irresponsable que parece difícil que de buena fe pueda hacerse algo así. Pero la decisión estuvo ahí, duró varios años, y fue precisamente en el periodo en el que la mafia albanesa, el cartel de los Balcanes, se instaló con comodidad en el Ecuador. Y a pesar de que las condiciones migratorias han cambiado, estuvieron dadas para convertirse en un lugar atractivo de operación, teniendo además las características geográficas que les comenté. El puerto de Guayaquil se convirtió en uno de los lugares más importantes para la comercialización de cocaína del cartel de los Balcanes hacia Europa. ¿Qué tenemos hoy en el Ecuador entonces? Es un lugar en el que se concentra todo esto de lo que estamos hablando. Tal vez en el tema institucional, aunque es muy doméstico, pero vale la pena como ejemplo. En el tema institucional, el Ecuador, en ese momento de malas decisiones, también decidió separar tanto de la policía como de las Fuerzas Armadas a 2 fuerzas de seguridad, las que estaban encargadas de las cárceles y las que estaban encargadas de los puertos. Entonces, en el Ecuador, la fuerza encargada del control de los puertos y aeropuertos no pertenece ni a la policía ni a las Fuerzas Armadas, y la fuerza encargada del control de las cárceles tampoco. En toda América Latina, en el tema de puertos y aeropuertos, esta situación solo es igual en Paraguay y en ningún lugar en el tema de las cárceles. Y mientras les cuento, seguramente a ustedes vienen las imágenes y los datos sobre lo que ha pasado en el Ecuador con las cárceles, con la violencia en las cárceles, con el transporte de cocaína y la larga lista que estoy haciendo. Si vemos esto en términos de una competencia o de una lucha entre el gobierno criminal y el gobierno institucional, yo añadiría que además el gobierno criminal tomó gran fuerza y gran predominancia en un momento en el que el gobierno estatal iba en retroceso y abandonaba muchas de sus tareas. Muchas de sus tareas las abandonaba alrededor de decisiones tan complejas como las que les estoy contando. El Ecuador entonces se ha convertido en un lugar en donde confluyen tres grandes organizaciones criminales de las más importantes de América Latina. En el Ecuador está la presencia del cartel de Sinaloa, de Jalisco Nueva Generación y del cartel de los Balcanes. Estas organizaciones tienen sus conexiones nacionales, no es que operan necesariamente o personalmente ahí, pero tienen sus conexiones y controlan desde ahí una buena parte del mercado de cocaína hacia los lugares de su interés. El rey de la cocaína, solo como un dato anecdótico, el rey de la cocaína, Ditran Rextepi, uno de los líderes, tal vez el más importante de Compañía Velo, una de las familias de los carteles de la mafia albanesa más importantes, estuvo preso en el Ecuador, porque estaba viviendo en el Ecuador. Y cuando fue pedido en extradición, consiguió comprar un grupo de jueces y ser liberado. Entonces, la combinación de las malas decisiones, la debilidad institucional, la operación de los carteles, los factores internos y los externos convierten al ejemplo ecuatoriano en uno de los más lamentables, pero también en uno en el que la región entera podría verse con alarma y con tarea. ¿Qué hacer? Que es la pregunta más difícil de todas. Y rápidamente voy a explorar 2, 3 líneas. Uno, yo creo firmemente y tal vez dadas las capacidades institucionales de nuestros estados, es una de nuestras más eficientes posibilidades de respuesta, pero en perseguir las economías criminales. Perseguir la economía criminal, no hacerlo desde el punto de vista solamente, no digo que abandonemos el enfoque de las personas que cometen actos criminales, pero el problema es que no vamos a tener cárceles suficientes si es que estas estructuras criminales, verdaderas industrias criminales, en nuestros países utilizan una cantidad de personas casi fungibles para la operación. The Telegraph, el diario inglés, publicó hace un año una investigación interesante y muy dolorosa sobre una escuela de sicarios de la mafia albanesa en Ecuador, en donde entrenaban niños para aprovechar el distinto tratamiento legal que tienen. Incluso los entrevistados por esta investigación cuentan de sus colegas y amigos que fueron trasladados a trabajar para la mafia albanesa en Europa desde este tipo de entrenamientos. Entonces, perseguir la economía criminal, disminuir la ganancia, elevar el riesgo, incautar los activos. Creo que es una de las posibilidades. Por supuesto, fortalecer las instituciones, y en esto me refiero con gran énfasis a la policía. En nuestros países no son las Fuerzas Armadas las que se encargan de la seguridad interna, es la policía la que necesita ser fortalecida, y las instituciones de seguridad son también los jueces, los fiscales y los sistemas penitenciarios. Y por supuesto, incrementar la cooperación para poder intercambiar información, operaciones y recibir toda la ayuda que países pequeños requieren para poder combatir organizaciones criminales que muchas veces tienen conexiones, tecnología y financiamiento que supera la capacidad institucional de nuestros países. Y esta es una verdad imposible de enfrentar sin cooperación en gran escala. Esas ideas. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, Maria Paula. As you were explaining, the trajectory of what has led, I think for one looking at the problem at a glance will think that this is just an emerging novelty that's happened in Ecuador, but it's clearly after your presentation that is really the result, is the compound effect of bad policies. And I really appreciate your very comprehensive suggestion on how to tackle this problem. So thank you.
Thank you.
Cesar. Thank you. You came at 5 a.m. from Bogota, so welcome. Thank you for making the effort. It's really fantastic. In talking to you earlier, I thought that what you have to present perhaps is a good case study to show what is possible with vision. So my question to you is, in what ways might local governments inadvertently enable TCOs, the transnational organized crime organizations, and how can cities undermine these networks?
Many thanks, Diu. 26 years ago, I started to work in security and defense, being part of the planning team of Plan Colombia. It was my first job in these issues. And when I was starting to work on this job, all our analysis about the problem was focused in the big picture of the problem. It was narcotics and international crime related with narcotics. And the migration of the problem, because as we were working on impact the business in Colombia, we were looking for the next places where the narcotics issues will take roots. When Dr. Griffith talked about Rumsfeld, in 2002 in Santiago, it was the Ministry of Defense conference, the fourth, I remember. And I was the assistant of the Ministry of Defense of Colombia. And we went to the meeting speaking to every Ministry of Defense in the hemisphere about the alerts that we saw in each country about the spreading of the problem. And all the ministers told us, this is a strategic problem, it's not a tactical problem, it's your problem. Every minister of the hemisphere, not Rumsfeld. Rumsfeld was working with us. 5 years ago, I started to work in security in local level for first time. And I started to see the problem from the bottom. After 20 years work, looking it from the top. The strengthening of transnational organized crime in the Western Hemisphere is related with the pandemics. Pandemics is a milestone in the strengthening of transnational organized crime. And why? General Robinson, the Southcom commander?
Yeah, General Richardson.
This morning, she told us about how in the region people is moving to autocracies, and the autocracies is in some kind of increasing of popularity in people. It's populism, autocracies, and this is the result of the lack of delivery over the citizens. And national states or national governments of the most high level in government in the states have not capabilities to deliver to the citizens. In pandemics, this was demonstrated. The maras in Central America bring people the services that a lot of countries couldn't give them. Why this turnaround about the problem? Because we start from the strategic vision of Dr. Banda, and I will be the next 10 minutes in the final of the problem. There is the cities. Why? Because this articulation of transnational organized crime is based on roots in big cities, where they develop the networks and the operational money, the money that supports the operation for the big earnings in the transnational markets. An example is my city, Bogota. Bogota is a big city, 8 million people live there. It's impossible for an organized crime band take control of the city. No one could took control of the city, but they fight to take some places in the city based on what? Narcotics distribution, migration control, smuggling of weapons or of merchandising, corruption. And is the transnational crime? Not. It's local crime. It's local crime that is contracted by transnational crime to create local markets for receive resources for financing the international operation. What this means? So we have to fight in the local level, because in the local level, we have citizens without delivery that will be recruited by the local organizations to serve to transnational organized crime. This occurs only in Bogota? Not. In Buenos Aires, La Salada, it's an example of this. In Santiago, the increasing of the narcotics market demonstrated. In Guayaquil, the port is a problem, but the choneros is a group of Colombian migrant people that starts bringing services, criminal services, to these Albanese and Mexican bands that only came to Ecuador to move the business, but not to administrate the business. But they contract the choneros to make the violence and the market. And what is giving the opportunity to create that kind of criminal network is the failure of delivery in the cities. Then it's very important to fight in the strategic level. But if we don't create a strategy and an effort to transformate the bottom, the tactical level, the fight at the strategic level will have not wins. It's necessary and is urgent to work in the weakening of the options for the transnational organized crime to use cities as the routine of the international system of crime. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cesar, to all of our panelists, for sure. Thank you for sharing that perspective at the much closer look. I didn't get a timer, Leland. Do we wrap it up or do we still have a couple of minutes for questions? Couple of minutes. Okay. So we have a couple of minutes, and with that couple of minutes queue, I will encourage our audience to ask questions, but please remember to keep your questions short, and for our panelists also to be succinct with your response. Anybody for questions? Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Maria Zuppello from Info by Brazil. I want to know your perspective about the Italian mafia and 'ndrangheta in Latin America, because when we think about Ecuador, behind the Banyans, you have 'ndrangheta in Brazil. PCC works for 'ndrangheta. So I want to know what's your perspective about it. Thank you.
Yeah, anybody would like to take it?
Sure. So, we have seen the expansion of European criminal groups into Latin America. So the traditional relationship where the Latin groups brought cocaine into Europe and then the Europeans would move it forward has started changing. There are multiple reasons why that started changing. Non-governmental has been on the forefront of pioneering many different activities, including starting to pioneer fentanyl in Europe, which incidentally is something that we haven't spoken about, overlaying the internationalization of crime is, of course, the global synthetic drugs revolution. And once that is already reshaping the relationship profoundly between North America and South America in terms of crime and in terms of focus of US foreign policy, but it can have really far more reaching consequences if synthetic opioids take off in Europe. All of a sudden, a lot of the Latin American context will become irrelevant. But we are still riding the peak of cocaine that started in Europe in the 1990s. And part of that was the move of the Italians into Latin America. I actually think the more interesting development is the move of the Balkans group into Latin America. But all of that, in my view, is quite ephemeral. And really the big earthquake will come when synthetic opioids take off in Europe, whether it's nitazines or fentanyl class of opioids.
Thank you. Thank you. We have one more question here. Yes?
Yes, thank you. And I join you, of course, in thanking the panel. Professor Griffith, the three typologies that I think you very clearly expounded on. With reference to that, where would you put the lagging legislation in the countries? Many of the countries have a difficulty adopting timely legislation, 3-4 years. In fact, some span election cycles. In your typology of the three, where would you place this? And how do you think we can address it? Of course, outside of the obvious, get more legislators. What's your thought on how we can fast track the legislation required to fight cybercrime? Thank you.
Thank you for the question, observation. The issue that you raise finds itself, in my view, in the first condition. In the first condition, where there's a reality manifesting itself of something akin to what we heard about Ecuador. Limitations of the institutions. And the legislative lag is a manifestation of limitations, not just of one institution in the governmental arena. Most Caribbean countries have a governmental arena where there's a link between the executive branch and the legislative branch. It is the government minister and the ruling party that brings the draft legislation to the parliament. And so any legislative gaps or legislative lag begs the question, where did the gap or the lag originate? It invariably doesn't originate in the parliament, it originates in the executive. But I think in most Caribbean countries, and this is true of many other countries in the hemisphere, including many in Central America, you've got a reality of where the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. It's not that the government and the legislators don't know of the gaps or the lags, but they've got so many things to deal with, so few staffers. If you go to the average Caribbean National Assembly, there is no staff to deal with. Many of the ministries are understaffed, and so the capabilities to research the issue, get adequate input from civil society before you come to the legislature with a draft, and for the legislature to really adequately discuss this issue before they pass on it, that's a desire that is not reflected in reality. I had the opportunity of speaking in the National Assembly to the legislature of a certain country that I will not name. And I was discussing with these members of the parliament a national security issue of their country. And I was amazed that most of them didn't have a clue. They have been so caught up in the day-to-day challenges of managing the insufficiencies that the strategic, taking a step back to understand what's the big picture. So that lag in legislature, A, is a manifestation of capability limitations in the executive branch and the legislative branch. And guess what? It's not the only capability insufficiency. Many countries, and this is true not only of Caribbean small states, but small states elsewhere, are practicing what was once defined as the science of muddling through. You're just coping with issues. You're overwhelmed. And so that is a reality that accentuates the vulnerability. Because guess what? The bad guys don't have all those limitations. They're able to access the resources. They're able to hire the attorneys. They're able to move quickly. And they get things delivered. So it's what you raise is a critical but manifestation of one of many problems of capability limitations of several branches. I was delighted to hear you talk about the 3 Ps: police, prosecution, and prisons. That's a manifestation of the entire Caribbean. And as I said yesterday at the book launch, invariably there's an attention to the front end, the police, and the army if there is a joint operation. But so much neglect about the courts, backlog of cases. And when you talk about the prisons, I've got the details of the overcrowding. And it's not only the deleterious effect on the prisoners. Think of the people who have to work as prison guards in those prisons. And they go home now to their families with that same attitude of having to manage, and they take it out on their families. Condition 1.
Thank you. Unfortunately, not only we just ran out of time, we went over time. So I just want very briefly here recap some of the big ideas in 30 seconds. Adaptability of illicit markets, transnationality of illicit enterprise, globalization of demands, just now, manifestation of many problems, challenge sovereignty, and I will finish with Cesar's words, transnational crime is local crime. Thank you so much to our panelists. This is just a conversation that started, we'll continue, so thank you.
Very good, much obligado.
Thank you so much to our final panel. And that concludes day 1 of our Hemispheric Security Conference.